Okay, you may begin. Enjoy your session.
Okay, now,
Yes.
hello
Vanessa.
everybody.
Hi. Are you happy with the screen sharing as it is?
Am I sharing my whole slides properly or just my PDF view of my slides?
I can see the PDF view of your slides.
Okay,
So
let's try that again.
into a slideshow.
All right, I'm going to share my Zoom screen for a second, and then we're going to switch to this. How's that?
Yes, there we go. Do you want to just advancing the slide quickly? Just want to test an advanced slide? Okay.
All right.
All right.
So, hello everyone. I'm going to give...
So next up we have Vanessa Teague. Vanessa is the CEO of Thinking Cybersecurity and is part of the Computer Science Research Group at the Australian National University. And Vanessa has been engaged in security and privacy research regarding data and e-voting and medical data. And she's a contributor to the MIT-led project PAC, which is private automated contact tracing. So Vanessa, today you're going to talk to us about how some contact tracing apps aren't as private as we thought. Over to you.
Thank you, Farah. Okay, first of all, this is not about PACT. This is primarily about social graph edge inference in both Australia's COVID tracing app and in GAPL systems. And really, this is two different 10-minute talks. The first one has not very much to do with crypto, but quite a lot to do with the real world. And the second has a little bit more crypto and a more tenuous connection with the real world. But here we are, real world crypto. I'm going to start talking about centralized versus decentralized contact tracing. This is a paragraph from the open letter, which many of us signed what seems like a very long time ago, but was actually less than a year ago. We said that we were extremely keen, or governments should be extremely keen to avoid solutions that allow reconstructing invasive information about individuals, and specifically the social graph. In other words, who has been nearby. Most countries, including Switzerland, heeded this advice, whether they wanted to or not, realising the practical superiority of GAEN systems. Australia did not. Australia, like France, Singapore, and a couple of other countries, insisted on using a centralised app which explicitly uploads to a government server the social graph of a person who has tested positive for COVID. So it uses Bluetooth low energy beacons, just like GAEN systems, but it what's contained in that beacon is an encryption of your ID. And when you test positive, you upload the list of all of the people you've been near over the last 2 weeks. So part of the point of this talk is to say that the implications of this are not quite what we imagined. First of all, we were mostly right, but we were also partly wrong. Here are some insights from what really happened when this app hit the road. First of all, it's really important to remember that not running something constitutes a spectacular privacy advantage. And most of the people who wrote a comment on the App Store wrote comments like this. This is not the App Store, this is Google's Play Store, but the Apple App Store is pretty similar. And the theme here, which very much reflects the other side of the coin that Carmela was talking about, is people are so upset with the battery usage that they uninstall the app. So the word uninstall appears in a very large fraction of comments about this app. If you're not running the app, you're not exposing any information to the government about the edges in your social graph. But it didn't stop there. The Australian app had a bunch of other unexpected privacy features. At one point, the implementation of encryption, specifically between the two versions of the iPhone version of the app, was devised in such a way that it transferred payloads that were sufficiently garbled that they couldn't be decrypted at the other end. So even if you did test positive and you did upload the list of people that you'd been near to the government server, the ciphertext was unreadable. So again, this is a fabulous privacy feature that wasn't really intended in the basis of this design. Another privacy feature was that, again, the iPhone version maxed out the Bluetooth connections of the phone, which is a thing I didn't even know it was possible to do, but apparently an iPhone is really only able to make 100 odd Bluetooth low energy connections, with the expectation that, you know, there's one for your speakers and maybe one for your diabetes monitor and one each for a series of other specific devices or connections that you want to make. It was never designed to do this kind of massive, complicated thing where you make new connections with dozens and dozens of other phones all the time. And the app wasn't properly designed to close them off. So after you'd met 100 people, it just, in one version of the app, just kind of stopped making new connections and recording new edges of the social graph. It also stopped talking to people's diabetes monitors and Apple Watches and so forth. So again, this motivated another whole group of people to uninstall it. And even if you hadn't uninstalled it, then in many cases it wasn't making new recordings of new social edges that you made. So one of the things that I think is quite interesting about this is we're very accustomed to security and privacy failures being invisible. And we know that an app can seem to be working perfectly well, but actually have serious security or privacy problems that are not evident to users. In the case of this Bluetooth-based contact tracing app, it's quite an unusual example in which actually just a basic functionality failure is, for all practical purposes, undetectable by ordinary users. You can kind of tell if you really set up your system carefully to read Bluetooth messages, but if you're just kind of using the app, you do not have any way of noticing that it isn't working. And in Australia, we really just don't know how many people are still actively running it. The government very proudly touts the download rate, which is quite high, but you saw from the comments that there's a good amount of anecdotal evidence that a large fraction of those people who downloaded it are not running it anymore. They have up-to-date information about who's running it just because of the way the protocol is designed. It effectively pings an Amazon server regularly. They could count that. If they are counting it, they're not saying. We suspect the actual number of people still running it is very low. And we also don't know what fraction of proximity events it detects. Those specific bugs that I mentioned earlier in the talk have mostly been fixed, but we don't have any kind of reliable data about the overall working of the system. We don't know whether the fact that we've spotted a certain number of different bugs and mostly got them fixed means that there aren't very many functionality bugs left, or whether that was just the tip of the iceberg and there are all kinds of situations in which it still doesn't work. We definitely know that there are some situations in which it simply does not work. For example, the situation in which two locked iPhones come into proximity with each other and not with any other phones. But we don't have overall data about its overall rate of success. But we do know that it's been basically useless in addressing the pandemic. This little quote is from a report by the Parliamentary Committee of my state parliament in Victoria, remembering that the app is a federal government initiative, and it says the effectiveness of the COVIDSafe app for Victoria's contact tracing efforts was insignificant. The app has helped find an additional 17 contacts not found through manual contact tracing. So this is in a nation of 25 million people. Admittedly, we haven't had very many cases, and admittedly, this 17 number is a little bit out of date. I think it's up to 20 or something now. But to find only 20 contacts in a population of 25 million people is really much, much less effective than anybody was hoping. So just in case anybody takes my previous remarks about non-functionality being a privacy feature too seriously, there's a very, very long list of issues that have imposed serious, not only serious functionality problems and usability problems, but also very serious privacy and security issues. I didn't discover most of these. Most of them were discovered by the long, long list of names that you see below. But I've been keeping a little summary on GitHub, which you can go and look at if you like. Just in case my remarks about privacy were too strongly worded, I've chosen a couple of random examples of other privacy issues that this app had, which had nothing whatsoever to do with inferring social graph edges. There was an issue discovered by Jim Massarad and Elwyn Tew, which was a silent pairing issue. In other words, when you're running the app, an attacker could kind of silently pair with your phone and bond with your phone in a way that allowed it not only to track your phone while you were using the app, but actually to extract the long-term identity of the phone, and in particular, a key called the identity resolving key, which I think is essentially used as a seed for generating the Bluetooth MAC address. So once you'd extracted this secret from the phone, you could track the phone forever, even after the person uninstalled the app. Here's another example, which does, for the first time, have a little bit to do with cryptography, is that they devised their own payload encryption algorithm, which had the interesting property that it had a plain text counter as part of the ciphertext, which isn't inherently a disaster until you realize that the plain text counter was a thing that got incremented every time you exchanged payloads with another person. And so this would kind of increment and increment and increment until a key refresh, which happened about every 5 minutes or so. And so you were effectively walking around kind of broadcasting a little count of how many other people you'd exchanged messages with in the last 5 minutes, which doesn't sound like a disaster, but it would certainly refute a claim that you had been alone in some circumstances, for example. This has now, I was going to say fixed, but I think it's more accurate to say this has been changed. And you can look at the list of issues to see in what way. So the first part of my conclusion, or rather the conclusion for the first part of my talk, is for centralized apps like COVIDSafe, inferring social graph edges is the least of our worries. There are all kinds of other privacy and security issues, like allowing for long-term tracking by third parties and exposing information about who you are and who you've communicated with, again, to third parties who are in your vicinity, never mind about whether you trust the government with sensitive information or not. And in fact, by far the greatest disappointment and concern about this app is simply that it doesn't seem to work. We're not sure how much it isn't working, but it definitely doesn't seem to be working well. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the second part of my talk, which is that actually GAEN systems didn't, at least in their early versions, protect the privacy of the social graph as much as you would hope. And in particular, there's a scenario in which malicious central government server can, if users opt to upload some extra information, can infer some social edges. So the background to this is that one of the things that happened almost immediately when GAEN systems started to be rolled out was that even though the system, as I understand it, was more or less designed to be used in the way that the Swiss used it, with all of the computation done on the user's phone and all of the inferences about whether or not the person had been exposed and the risk computations and so forth being done on the phone. Many governments immediately tried to get users to opt in to uploading more information. And although this wasn't really encouraged, it also wasn't explicitly prohibited anywhere that I found. I know, for example, that the Irish app allows people to opt in to a notification to the government that they have been exposed, that their app has told them they've been exposed. It doesn't convey the detailed information needed for this attack, but it conveys effectively one bit of information. So the setting in which this attack works is a hypothetical setting in which the user opts in to uploading the detailed exposure information data, which is not just the fact that they've been exposed, but the list that the API outputs to the app of what the exposures were, approximately how long they were, what the day of exposure was, and approximately what durations the exposures were. So this is a little record of some de-identified information about the exposures that led to the conclusion that the person had potentially been exposed to COVID. Now, I don't know for sure that any apps actually did this, but I looked through both Google and Apple's documentation. I couldn't find any prohibition against doing this. I should also say that this issue was fixed in June before I notified, before I knew about it and before I notified either of the manufacturers. So I didn't discover this for the first time. It seems to have been fixed before I noticed it, but I think it's interesting and worth explaining because I haven't seen it written up elsewhere. Both manufacturers have now fixed it by shuffling the exposure information before it says uploaded on my slide, but I mean exported from the API to the app. So as long as the order of those exposure records is shuffled, the problem seems to go away. Okay, so here's the setting in which we're working. Suppose Annika tests positive for COVID, and she has an interview with some human contact tracers in which she tells the human contact tracers that she had specific contacts with Bob, Charlie, and Dan. And she tells the contact tracers in some detail about, maybe she was talking to Bob for 20 minutes and she had her phone in her handbag, and then she passed Charlie for 5 minutes and she pulled her phone out and looked something up, and she interacted with Dan in some other way that she describes in a reasonable amount of detail. This kind of detail does get conveyed in contact tracer interviews. Later, but crucially, Annika doesn't want to admit to the authorities that she met with Whit, and she doesn't tell the human contact tracers about a meeting with Whit that she had on the same day. And nevertheless, the authorities are very interested in the possible existence of this connection, and that's what they want to find out. So we have to assume that later in the day, Whit and at least some of Annika's friends also test positive and upload their diagnosis keys to the GAEN system. Now, this may seem like a lot of coincidences. It's actually not a crazy set of coincidences if we assume that Annika was the source of the infection, and Annika infected many of her friends and then her friends tested positive. It doesn't have to be all of her friends, it just has to be some fraction of them, of those blue lines that she describes to the human contact tracers. So here's how the authorities can infer the existence of that social edge between Annika and Whit. I'm going to start from the start of my fancy video again. In the beginning, the public exposure key list that comes from the government server is supposed to be randomly shuffled. But let's suppose that the malicious authority doesn't shuffle it randomly, but instead very deliberately organises the published exposure keys in such a way that Whit is at the very end and the contacts that Annika admitted to are arranged in a very specific order just beforehand, like this. So that exposure key set gets conveyed to Annika's phone. Annika's phone, at least in the old versions of the GAEN API, would filter this list deterministically and not shuffle. And if Annika agreed to upload the result of all that exposure information back to the government server would get, in order, the de-identified records of each of those interactions. Now, it wouldn't say who was who, and actually Annika doesn't even know which filtered record corresponds to which of her interactions, but there's enough metadata in each of those records, or there could be enough metadata in each of those records, such as the duration and intensity of the interaction, to allow the authorities to re-identify the records of Bob, Charlie and Dan. And if that's the case, and the authorities are able to see very clearly that the records of the contacts that Annika admitted to appear in order, in a way consistent with the account that she gave to human contact tracers, then the crucial piece of information that they can look for very simply is whether there's another record after that list. And if there is a record that follows on from the records they can identify for Bob, Charlie and Dan, and if they've organised it carefully so that Whit is the only possible person who could appear after that, then they know for sure that there was an edge in the social graph between Annika and Whit. So this relies crucially on being able to identify the records for the people that Annika admits that she did have something that she did have some contact with. It doesn't have to be all of them, but it has to be enough of them to be able to align that list of records with the uploaded exposure information that she returns to the government server. Okay, so in conclusion, we were mostly right about centralised versus decentralised contact tracing. All other things being equal, decentralised apps protect the privacy of users, and in particular the social graph, but also other things, better than centralised ones. However, the all other things being equal thing is actually an important caveat, and all of the people who in Australia did download the app, did want to use it, possibly turned on their Bluetooth contrary to their habit, and would have been still walking around with Bluetooth turned on and the GAEN app running if we'd had a GAEN app, have in fact uninstalled it, possibly turned their Bluetooth off, and are now protecting their privacy much better than they would be if they'd been using almost anything else, even including the extremely well-designed Swiss app. But centralised apps are used a lot less because they eat through people's batteries in a catastrophic way, and they have a whole host of other problems. And then the second part of the talk is to say, although the GAEN apps, if they're used in the way they were designed for, and probably as they are in Switzerland and many other countries, I'm pretty sure there isn't a way for the authorities to infer the edges of the social graph. If you insist on using it in a way it wasn't intended to be used in, there was a way to infer edges of the social graph. It has been fixed now by shuffling on the client side by both Apple and Google before Annika's list of exposure information is returned to the server. And obviously it's fixed by refusing to convey that information back to the authorities as well. So overall, it's certainly clear that GAEN apps are much better than centralised apps, especially if you care about function rather than just caring about privacy. But I think it's important to realise that there are unintended privacy consequences, and there might be other privacy impacts that we don't currently know about. So I'll leave it there and invite questions.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you for your answer into the Australian app. There are a few questions in Zulip, so I'll start with one from Ari. Are you aware of any attacks on the app in the wild? And I think this is the Australian app. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I don't know how I managed to mute myself in the context of listening to Ari's talk. Hi, Ari. Not as far as I'm aware. And I think part of the answer is that probably its usage is very low. I'm not certain, but there's probably not really anything to, there's probably not enough users to bother implementing much of an attack. On the other hand, it's important to realize that attacks, particularly privacy attacks, would be invisible, right? So if there are shopping centers using it to track customers or some other nasty surreptitious thing, we wouldn't know.
Great, thank you. There's a second question. I believe Android's location. Was there any investigation? Contact info Android's location services collects, and this is a question from James.
Sorry, I actually missed the first part of the question. Can you believe that Android location services had to be turned on for the app to run? Is that correct? And is there information about how much Google can infer as a result? Yeah, this is a really good question. So Android, as you probably know, Android requires the global location setting to be turned on if you are scanning for Bluetooth Low Energy. And the thinking is, of course, that if an app is allowed to scan for Bluetooth low energy beacons, then it can effectively do its own location tracing. So the argument is, whether you agree with the argument or not, the argument is that this is a nice way of conveying to users the idea that this app can has the potential to track their location. I don't know how much information about people's proximity can be conveyed to Google as a result of this. The app did not use location services. In other words, it did not ping back to Google and ask Google where the user was at the time. So it had to have that capacity turned on, but it didn't take advantage of anything other than the opportunity to scan. So I guess if you're not actually querying Google's location services at the time you are near somebody else, then I assume that Google doesn't have an immediate way of inferring that you are near another person. But I don't really know exactly how it works, and I'm not sure how frequently an Android phone would be querying Google's location services as a general rule.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you again for the talk, and thank you for joining us from Australia. I know the timing is awkward for you.
Thanks, everybody.
There are some questions still in Zulip for you, so if you have time or appetite, given that it's a strange hour for you, you can continue the discussion with members of the audience in Zulip. But thank you again, Vanessa. And thank you.
Thanks.